Our very special guest is Martha Selvin, a driver of thought leadership on ocean sustainability agenda, including the Ocean Climate Nexus. She monitors just transitions in ocean industries, along with ocean governance, planning, biodiversity, as well as leading engagements within the sector of the United Nations Global Compact. Martha, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us for the UN Ocean Decade, which focuses on a productive ocean.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and what a wonderful introduction as well.
Martha, with regards to a productive ocean, I've always believed in harvesting the fruits of the ocean in a sustainable and clean fashion, which brings me to ask you about this term aquaculture. What are the potentials of harvesting the ocean?
That's a really good question. I have to start with a sort of almost not joke, but I remember when I started working at the UN Global Compact, I definitely wasn't quite aware of what the actual difference was between fishing and aquaculture. I think I used the terms quite interchangeably. And then soon after a year, realized that they are really quite different things. So when we talk about, just for everyone's benefit, we talk about fishing, the fishing industry, we're talking about vessels, so fishing vessels that are going around plowing the ocean, some sustainably, some not so sustainably. When we talk about aquaculture, we're talking about farming. We're talking about literally fish farming. So often you see these circular pens in the ocean, and these are really used to breed certain kinds of fish, salmon, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to sort of sustainable aquaculture, we see lots of really exciting opportunities, because what we're seeing increasingly is not just a pen with, let's say, one type of fish like salmon. We're seeing sort of multi-trophic aquaculture. So what does that mean? This means basically layers of different species. So for instance, starting with seaweeds, which are sort of also sequestering carbon and also really promising for climate, but then also mollusks and bivalves, sort of your lower layer almost of the food chain. And then at the top you have, let's say, a salmon or some other kind of fish. So it's much more natural. It's a much more ecosystem-based approach to aquaculture, and it's definitely something that we are heavily promoting, because not only is this a way then to increase sustainable protein by having actually sustainably managed fish, but it's also a way to give back to the ocean ecosystem by having more seaweeds, by having more mollusks and bivalves, which are actually carbon negative, in case you didn't know. So yeah, so these are really exciting opportunities. Of course, it has to be said in all these discussions, there are forms of aquaculture which aren't good. So for instance, these mono aquaculture farms, sometimes they can be quite bad for that species and also that area of the ocean. But there is increasingly great things happening when it comes to regenerative aquaculture, multi-trophic aquaculture, and definitely something that needs to be put forward and promoted much more, particularly in the decade.
So what is this mono aquaculture you're telling me about?
So this isn't always necessarily a bad thing, but I think in the past, aquaculture has sometimes got a bad reputation for having sort of monopens of, let's say, just one breed of fish, which has in turn sometimes produced lice, some kind of diseases, just like having too much of anything. And this isn't always a bad thing. Of course, there are some really good sustainably managed aquaculture pens, but you know, why have that when you can move to something that is much more ecosystem based and much more, as I said, you know, tapping into the benefits of having a seaweed farm which is integrated into an aquaculture pen. And also this is, you know, like all these things, the key message here is this saves money. There's a business case for doing it like this, right? You have a healthier part of the ocean. The seaweeds can then also in turn produce food and feed for the aquaculture, so for the fish that are bred there. And so why would you not want to have that kind of win-win solution almost?
Absolutely. And how does this actually help in the livelihoods of coastal communities?
Well, I mean, firstly, recognizing that aquacultures and fisheries happens in very different places of the world under very different conditions. So it's quite hard to sort of give a straight answer to what that might look like. Of course, you know, depending on where you are in the world, and, you know, most coastal communities are still fish producing in whatever way, shape or form that might be, from the coast of Norway to the coast of the US. small island developing states, and then fishing is consequently done in different ways and using different methods. I think what's good and what's exciting is that now we're moving more towards a recognition that seafood is part of the solution if done so sustainably. And through that recognition, we need to produce more seafood, but in a more sustainable way. Now, we know that 50% of seafood is imported from the developing world. So what that means in practice, and what one would hope it would mean in practice, is a recognition that we need more sustainable seafood, then in turn supporting the livelihoods of coastal communities, particularly from the developing world, and to have more business to an extent. And what is important though, and what has to be said, is we need to then move away from this large scale industrial fishing, where quite often what you have are these huge, there was an awful news article and story recently of this huge industrial fishing boat which literally leaked thousands of fish into the Atlantic. I don't know if you came across it.
No, I didn't come across that one.
Yeah, it was a really startling image, actually, really quite a terrifying image. But my point with that is that we need to move away from this sort of huge industrial fishing fleet, which sort of, you know, moves around islands, coastal states, and takes all the fish in a really unsustainable way, but actually sort of artisanal aquacultures, small scale fisheries. You know, this is good for the planet and good for that local community. So the more we can inspire, you know, for instance, certification standards to actually reward small scale and not discipline, but halt this kind of large scale movement, I think that could really support coastal communities.
No, that's really true, because even when I was speaking to another NGO who works with local fishermen who use the fish and line technique, they've been complaining about what commercial fishing has been doing to their fish stock.
Yeah,
you know, so it's quite sad, actually.
Of course, and exactly. And, you know, this, I think Seaspiracy, which I'm guessing you've seen, or some of the listeners have seen, was really interesting because, you know, on the one hand, isn't it great when finally people, the wider public, are talking about something that you've been talking about for ages? And I think what Seaspiracy did well was to bring this sometimes very murky and transparent industry more into the spotlight.
Yeah.
But of course, a bit sensationalist. I mean, a little bit, not entirely completely capturing some of the really good things that are happening in the industry. But of course, the bad things are bad.
Yeah.
And, you know, the example I just gave, for instance, of this huge industrial fish trawler that just leaked, you know, tons and tons of fish into the ocean. I mean,
so sad.
What is that doing to that ecosystem? It's just terrible. So then, of course, you have small scale local fishermen who, you know, go out, and that entire fish stock has just been plowed empty. And that's not even going into, there's a bit of sort of scientific debate around this at the moment, but there was a really interesting paper that came out, I think it was around this time last year, that quantified the amount of carbon that is released when these big fishing trawlers basically trawl the bottom of the ocean, and they don't actually, you know, just catch seafoods and different kinds of fish. They're just literally trawling the ocean floor, and actually by trawling the ocean floor, you're releasing a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which actually much, you know, outweighs the benefits of having a more low carbon source of food like fish. Once again, there's still quite a lot of debate around this topic, so I'm not going to pronounce it to be definite, but it is something to think about in this debate. But as I said, that wouldn't be happening anyway if we moved more towards local artisanal fishing, which is what we've done for years, right? And then suddenly in the industrial times, we've now moved to this huge, large scale fishing, which isn't sustainable for people or planet.
Absolutely. This is a topic we can probably discuss throughout.
Yes.
I mean, the entire, we need a separate session for this. But
yes.
coming back to what you said in the beginning of the conversation, that marine aquaculture helps in carbon sequestering. So for those listening, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting, actually. And I mean, we're talking here about types of ocean plants that aren't spoken about so much. So what I always find interesting or sometimes quite crazy is that, you know, you'll see when you're going to fly somewhere that there's an opportunity to plant a tree. And we're obsessed with terrestrial forests, which we certainly should be, right? I'm not saying that we should be. But when you compare that to, for instance, mangroves, seagrasses, seaweeds, they actually sequester 4 times more carbon out of the atmosphere. So that is actually really substantial. Seaweed in particular has huge potential in terms that it takes more carbon out of the atmosphere that it would then release. And that's what we call, that's basically what carbon sequestration is. And what we see, for instance, in seaweeds, which is very interesting, is they'll sequester quite a lot of carbon, and then often they fall back into the ocean floor and then create carbon sediments. So it's a very natural carbon cycle that we have with seaweeds. Now, when I mentioned at the beginning, what we're trying to, you know, which is just generally quite a movement or that we're looking at when we talk about sustainability now, is how can we combine as many co-benefits as possible? So not only do we want to have, let's say, an aquaculture pen that is sustainable, if we can then also add seaweeds, which are in turn taking more carbon out of the atmosphere, you know, that is a double win and a double benefit. And particularly, you know, the same for terrestrial forests when we talk about nature-based solutions or kind of carbon sequestration. These are natural ways to take the carbon out of the atmosphere that we've been pumping into it for so long. So things like restoring mangroves, restoring and protecting seagrasses, and restoring seaweed forests that have been lost over the past years are really natural ways to start regaining some of this balance. And just to know, as a sort of disclaimer, which is important in this discussion, when we say, and particularly also because I gave the flying example, I'm by no means promoting to plant seaweed forests and then get a plane. That's definitely not what I'm saying. It's just more that kind of stark comparison when you realize that, you know, at COP26, we spoke about how we should be replanting and restoring our Earth's forests, but there was no discussion around how we should be restoring natural ocean ecosystems like seaweeds and mangroves for the same thing. So I think it's about trying to break through that silo and break through that narrative that, yes, it's good that we're replanting trees, but why aren't we talking about replanting and restoring oceans? Because let's face it, 70% of the planet, you'd think you'd have more of a chance and to start taking in more of the carbon than we would by replanting trees.
That's true. That brings me quickly to my next question. Do you think we could over-harvest the sea vegetables? And do you think that could deplete the stocks? Because I keep hearing that kelp has the possibility of growing very quickly. Do you think that could actually happen versus what is happening to the terrestrial forests?
It's a tricky one. I mean, firstly, there are so many different kinds of seaweeds as well that I think it kind of very much depends on which ones you're talking about. But of course, you know, there's a fear, and a very valid fear, you know, that what you might get if you now over plant or over harvest seaweeds is just another ecosystem imbalance, right? Because what you're basically saying is you are having taken away a lot of what was natural and what was there before in terms of seaweeds. If you're now going to over harvest and now over put it in, it's still an ecosystem that isn't entirely healthy or in balance. And this is a very valid concern raised by a number of particularly biologists and marine biologists when we talk, for instance, about almost a geoengineering of having and planting and harvesting, you know, acres and acres worth of seaweeds. Now, of course, and you know, what is a bit tricky about this debate is sometimes the way to think about it, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily what I think, but then the counter argument to that is we have so much carbon that we need to take out of the atmosphere that, okay, we might have we don't know what's necessarily going to happen to that specific ocean ecosystem, but actually is the consequence worse than the cure to an extent? And that's something that is hotly debated, and I don't have the answer to, but I think we're sadly at the stage now where, you know, where if we don't take drastic action, you know, the risks to human life, the risks to ocean ecosystem are just enormous. So it's a really tough one, but I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, harvesting the ocean or restoring or, having, larger seaweed forests, for instance, that may not have been there before. Of course, there are potential challenges to that natural ecosystem which need to be respected, and more research needs to be done. But we also need to acknowledge that there's a lot of extra carbon that needs to be taken out of the atmosphere if we're going to stay within healthy planetary boundaries.
Not true. And that's why we have you guys who put systems in place so that things of this sort can be done sustainably, and not just, rampaging through the kelp forest and saying, yes, now this is the new alternative to, the food industry. So let's go ahead and overharvest it. But we've been talking about kelp basically being able to solve world hunger, right? So that's like the new big thing. But have you been able to educate people on that?
Well, luckily I have a fantastic colleague, Vincent, who is doing an amazing job who I know you've spoken to at doing so. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, it's I find the whole we had some very interesting discussions with some leading consumer brands around, how can we, and once again, this is a bit of a Western perspective, because of course in Asia, kelp and seaweeds are already, high on the agenda when it comes to consumption. One of the things that we are trying to explore, or some leading consumer brands are exploring, are sort of around integrating seaweeds into things like pasta or burgers, or sort of, I don't know, these kinds of foods that one might more commonly see on a menu, let's say somewhere in Europe or wherever it might be. It's a bit sad that we have to sort of really integrate seaweeds into something like a burger or pasta. But if that's something that we have to do to get it more on the menu. And also this notion, and I like how you said sea vegetable, it's sometimes the language we use around the ocean just isn't helpful. True. And I wonder if that's something that you found as well, because often, it's
a weed.
Yes, a weed, or like, it's kind of going back to what we discussed before about why don't we call them sea forests? If we called it a sea forest, maybe we'd think more about restoring, but a seaweeds, or just sometimes I feel like the language we use in the marine space doesn't quite actually add up to what you would call it in the terrestrial space. So yeah, Absolutely. It's a vegetable. These are all vegetables. Seaweeds are vegetables, but we call them different terms that then I think causes kind of confusion. And this goes back to, kind of the core aim of the decade, right? Ocean literacy. But ocean, for me, ocean literacy, yes, it's about educating about the ocean, but it's also trying to bring the ocean more into the current day and age and space and the terms that we commonly use.
Very true.
You know what I mean? I think it's a bit of both. Yes, it's educating on the ocean, but yeah, let's maybe think more about how we as marine lovers and people who work in the ocean space can start bringing these terms in context that they are being used. So yes, a sea vegetable. I have this, moving away from seaweed to something completely different. I have this a lot working with companies around shipping and the word maritime, for instance. If you're a leading consumer brand and you're conducting your supply chain due diligence, and you hear the word ships and maritime, you think, oh, that doesn't apply to me. That's something that happens very far away on the oceans. But of course, most brands rely on shipping to transport their goods.
True.
So if they are not taking supply chain due diligence or not taking this part of their supply chain seriously, they're missing out a huge chunk and could have some adverse human rights impacts. But once again, it's the word maritime that they think, oh, so, I now use the word logistics. I say, these are logistic workers, these are logistics. And suddenly people are like, oh, that's something that applies to me. So once again, I think, sea vegetables, yes. Logistics, yes. Let's, if people don't want to come and meet us, then we'll have to go and meet them.
Absolutely. And I do agree with your elegant analogies, which is so important for basically the ocean and the rest that's going to follow with it. So what do you think about scaling this business, and what, according to you, is the future going to look like
for aquaculture?
Yeah,
I think, sorry, the lights have gone out. I'm trying to get them back on. Sorry, everyone. I think what's been really great, particularly last year, is the release of the Blue Food Assessment. I don't know if that's something that you came across. But this was a really science-led huge assessment, really quantifying the potential for blue foods, including aquacultures, but also seaweeds, and really trying to get it high on the policy agenda, right? Because for a lot of these things, as always, yes, we're seeing more of a business push, and yes, we're seeing more sustainable businesses, but we really need this to come from governments. We really need governments to also provide incentives for these kind of farming. I mean, when we talk about subsidies in fishing, they're just through the roof, but where are the kind of incentives for multi-trophic aquacultures? Where are the incentives? Why aren't we rewarding fishermen who are integrating seaweed farming or aqua, why is that not something that is being rewarded? So for me, that will be the really key lever. What's quite interesting is we're seeing, particularly in Europe, a sort of increase when it comes to offshore renewable energy, of then driving or scaling up offshore renewable energy and combining energy parks with seaweed or aquaculture and having these kind of multi-use, multi-trophic approaches, which I think is really interesting and could also potentially help to scale up that innovation. Oh, the lights got on. And scale up that innovation. But yeah, I think really having a high level recognition from policymakers, and not just your kind of marine policymakers, but from your agriculture ministries, from your environmental ministries, just recognizing how important ocean solutions like aquacultures are to the climate agenda, but also the broader sustainable development agenda, and having their support, whether that be through incentives and also getting rid of these subsidies. I think that will be a really key part moving forward. And then, of course, one final thing, which is exciting, is we are seeing a rise of sustainable finance and an increasing rise in things like blue financing. So blue bonds. And we actually saw the first fish company, Thai Union, not fish company, my brain's gone blank, but you know what I mean, fishing company, launch a blue bond and it had 3 sort of sustainability criteria linked to it. So that's really exciting. So I think also if we see a sort of rise in financial appetite for sustainable seafood, and that could also in turn help to scale that up and particularly support, small scale innovators and entrepreneurs.
Wonderful. Martha, thank you so much for joining us and giving us insights into this valuable industry and how it's beneficial to the ocean decade and a productive ocean. So for the people listening, how can they follow you and learn about your wonderful endeavors?
Excellent question. So you can follow our work at UN Global Compact Ocean Action, and then you can follow me on Twitter, Martha Selwyn.
Thank you so much, Martha, once again, and stay safe.
Thank you, Runa. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm joined by Kasya Patel, who's the Program Director for Oceanic Global, a marine conservation nonprofit focused on engaging new audiences in ocean conservation. Kasya, welcome to the UN Decade for Ocean Science.
Thank you so much, Runa, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And it's going to be your second time. Thank you so much for making the time to join us again. Kasya, let's dive right in. Now, we keep hearing this term, which is called ecotourism, this word, basically. What exactly is ecotourism?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's certainly a term applied to a variety of operations, and it's a big sector. I think also, I know on our last conversation too, we spoke a little bit about the concept of greenwashing and just being sure to be really intentional about what we're saying, what that means. And I think in this field, and I really appreciate the question around specificity. I think in this field too, it is really important to understand exactly how can the tourism industry perpetuate and actually help create a sustainable economy? What does that really mean? And I know that this can be a bit of a controversial space because there are multiple opinions. On one side, we really saw tourism decrease for a period during the pandemic. It's coming back up now, but we saw when things went quiet and we saw ecosystems regenerate in different ways. We saw sea otters coming back to places in Southeast Asia where they hadn't been in years. So there's an aspect of just reducing the number of travelers, certainly leading to more beneficial circumstances for the environment. And yet we also could see, and communities were feeling this really strongly, that when that stopped, areas that are largely tourism dependent, or where their economy is largely touristic, that is then impacting economies as well. So I think there's this duality, and it's a fine line to walk to better understand how can we be operating a tourism economy in a sustainable way, whether we're talking about hotels, if we're talking about tour operators, the types of tours and guides that are ongoing, if we're talking about the actual travel to get down there, of course, air travel and emissions. So it is a much broader concept, but I would just say to synthesize in essence, ecotourism is the concept of using tourism as a vehicle for driving positive environmental change. And that can be at a more local level, and it can also be at a global level. But there are ways that the tourism industry can also inspire us to change our behavior at home within different businesses. That's our whole philosophy at Oceanic Global with our program, The Blue Standard, to actually hold global accountability and recognition for specifically hotels, restaurants, events that are doing the right thing, to celebrate them for that, to help them do that. Many businesses do want to do the right thing. They just don't know how, or think it's going to be expensive or difficult. So just trying to make that easier. And then to also have a shared definition of what is best practice. What does that really look like? We focus a lot on eliminating single-use plastics, improving waste management, sourcing local food, sourcing responsible seafood, bringing educational experiences into getting guests actually to connect with local economy. I know we were just chatting. I just got back from a trip in Baja, Mexico, and was spending some beautiful time on the ocean there. And I saw two incredible examples of ecotourism that I think really bring in this concept of community resilience as well. One example, just to give a shout out, is an accommodation called La Duna. They're north of La Paz on the Gulf of California side of the peninsula there. And it's this incredible land that they're protecting. So the original families who ancestrally have owned this land or had this land, they are maintaining that and refusing to give in to larger developers. You know, they're holding this. It's these beautiful fields and forests of cacti. These cacti are 300, 400 years old. And it goes right down through the sand dunes to the beach, and you can see the mountains. There is so many variety, so many species of seabirds and turtles and dolphins and whales that come in here during their seasons when they're with their young. So it's mothers and calves. It's so beautiful. So this really thriving ecosystem that is under attack from development. And so they've held it there, and they have these small villas for people to stay. It's all solar paneled, composting toilets, solar showers. You heat your water up in the sun, and that's what you're using. And yet it still feels so comfortable and has a high level of service and quality. The food is amazing. So I think that's one example of a hotel and stay, where then they're also working and supporting local fisher cooperatives. They do educational programming on environmental restoration. They're developing a mangrove restoration program. They're learning about permaculture and how to bring this back. So constantly learning to bring back. They've been working for 22 years and feel like they're just getting started. So I think it is this constant learning to figure out how do we bring in sustainability, bring in regenerative practices to actually bring life back into places and restore what's been damaged. And then on that note, the other example I wanted to share is more from a tour operator perspective, which is actually closer to La Paz. There is a fishers cooperative called OPRE, O-P-R-E, and they've been really supported by a local nonprofit there called NOS. And essentially it's community driven. The community realized that in the 70s, the fishery in the bay by La Paz was beautiful and rich and thriving and healthy. They've watched that decline. They know that this is happening because of overfishing, pollution, other stresses the environment is coping with. So together they decided to rally, create a fishers cooperative to sustainably fish and farm and harvest in the bay. And so they're doing that in a really successful way. And it is not easy to build trust in a community and do what they're doing. And they've been really building that over the past decades. So what they're doing now is, and they just started this, is to offer tours to tourists and to show everybody the story of the harbor. This is where their ancestors are actually indigenous communities and tribes in Mexico. And so sharing how this is where our ancestors settled, and they were free dive for these clams and scallops. So, they were fishers, and that's what built this whole economy that then actually created La Paz, the city. And so they tell you that story. They bring you out there. When we were out there, there were dolphins all around us. We could see the birds. The sea turtle came back. A beautiful story is actually that the day that they got a concession from the government to, have exclusive fishing rights in this harbor for that community of 80 families in this fisher collective. The day that they signed that paperwork and got that access, a sea turtle came on shore. And that was the first sea turtle they had seen in 40 years in this area.
Wonderful.
And so it's this incredible sign, and a positive moment of what's to come. And they've definitely seen that. And so they bring you out there, they go free diving, they bring up the clams, and then they make lunch for you on the beach there. And so you really get to experience and celebrate that and support them with the tour. And that goes directly into supporting the Fishers Collective and doing all the work that they do in restoration. They're planting these larvae, they're bringing these populations back very intentionally. They actually started with massive cleanups of the whole bay, all the toxic pollution, and taking that out. Trucks and tires and leaching batteries, these larger scale issues that they had to start with. And now it's more about mangrove restoration and building up these populations of the clams. But anyways, I know that I really dove into those two examples, but I just think that they are beautiful examples of what this can look like and how it can be a part of a local community there too. So it's social and environmental.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you think this is kind of picking up, or do you think ecotourism is something which is very exclusive? And like if I have to travel and I want to go to a marine protected area, do you think this is something which I need to look into, or would it be available in the future? Because it definitely, like you said, it has communities involved. It helps the marine protected areas, and at the same time, it educates people. Yeah. So do you think it is the future and this is the way to go?
I definitely think so. And I think, and it is getting easier, although we're excited for it to become even easier to find those options, as you mentioned. Two recent partners actually that I can share and point people to are voyage.com. They're actually about to rebrand with a couple of really exciting things later this month. But they are a platform where you can identify and actually directly book eco hotels that they have identified, and they show you their eco score and rating. So we're collaborating with them, particularly from a plastic and waste perspective, but just across networks, because they've really built this beautiful and global database. And then Book Eco Hotels is another one, and they've just launched in January. And what they're doing is identifying hotels that have publicly shared other certifications, because there are many sustainable tourism certifications out there. Earth Check, Green Globe, Green Key, just to name a few. The Blue Standard, of course, as we exist and are getting out there too. And so they're cross-referencing those lists and just sharing that, making that available, so that your search as a traveler, you're like, okay, I'm going to Morocco. Who can I support in Morocco? How do I find this in a way that's, I don't have to be an expert in sustainable tourism. I just want to support businesses that I align with, with my values. So they do make that easy for you, those two platforms. And then I would just also say in general, booking.com as well, they actually do have a sustainability badge that they've introduced. They are interested in helping businesses and travelers better identify sustainable practices there too. That is a voluntary badge, because just to make it easy and for their community to start getting involved. But I would say that's the first layer, and that makes it easier because many people use booking.com already. So then you can go on there and have that extra identifier. I know we've been speaking with Yelp actually for a long time. They also wanted to create some kind of green 5-star rating as well for restaurants. Right now that all comes through in the reviews, but it's once we can work with these larger scale platforms, and Airbnb has this interest too, I think once these platforms can really start actually sharing those reviews and ratings, it will just be even easier. And we're just on the brink of that. Everyone's just starting to innovate, and how to not reinvent everything that already exists. How do we cross pollinate between what's out there already? But yeah.
I think this is really useful. I think it's super helpful to the listeners also, because it definitely shows you how you could get into ecotourism and search for places of this sort, because a lot of people, including me, I didn't even know about this. Yeah. So thank you for that. So tell me about Oceanic Global and your ecotourism initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I touched upon it just a little bit, but maybe I can share more high level. Oceanic
Yes,
Global,
please.
our theory of change is to drive scalable behavior change. And so really thinking about what actions we can take at the individual level, within our own communities, at the business level, as I mentioned, through the Blue Standard, actually working directly with hotels, restaurants, events, even sports stadiums and office spaces as well. But with relation to tourism, and focus on the hotels and restaurants, but working with them to help them find these solutions. And so I mentioned we focus a lot on plastic and waste. And our highest level recognition within the Blue Standard, you can earn 1, 2, or 3 stars essentially. And 3 stars is basically plastic free, single-use plastic free. And so within that, we do have an assessment, and we're looking at what a business currently is purchasing and sourcing and what they're currently doing. And once we see that they are using single-use plastic, we will help connect them with actual solutions in what we call our blue list. So we have a blue list of vendors globally, currently 300 and growing, that are offering these alternatives to single-use plastics, but also alternatives that are offering, non-toxic cleaning products, or traceable, responsible seafood, or other options depending on where you are. I think we'll hone in that solutions tend to just be local. So really trying to find those local solutions in each location, but we will help connect the dots there. And then we do also have a program where we are training blue consultants. So we have consultants around the world. It's a network of independent contractors. They might be existing consultancy agencies, for-profits, could be nonprofits that are active in an area. It could be individuals, emerging young professionals as well, who are very interested in this movement. So we can train them with the skill set to actually be the ones helping these businesses, and conducting the assessment, giving the recommendations, connecting them with solutions, doing the trainings, employee trainings as needed too, so that the full team has all the education and knowledge to make these initiatives successful as well. So that's a big part of how our program is going. Yeah,
that's awesome. That's fantastic. Lovely to hear that. Do you also engage a lot of coastal communities in your initiatives?
Yes, and I think just by being an ocean nonprofit, we just tend to be drawn towards ocean communities. Although the program can be implemented anywhere, even if you're totally landlocked. But we do, we also have been doing a more recently having a focus on destination-wide or island-wide, particularly programs. So in Barbados, we've been working for the past few years with the UNDP Accelerator Lab there, that covers Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, to implement what was previously the Oceanic standard, what's currently blue, the Blue Standard, with businesses in Barbados, and hiring local consultants, working with the UNDP. There was a ban on single-use plastics, a nationwide ban introduced in 2019 in Barbados. And so we came in directly before and after that to make sure that businesses were educated, knew how to achieve that. With a lot of these plastic bans, we see that they go into effect, but it can be, first of all, difficult to enforce. And second of all, there's often not enough information to support businesses in finding other options. And so that's what our work in Barbados was really focused on. Similarly, in the Bahamas, we're working now on a project with the TDC, which is the Tourism Development Center, but also the Ministry of Tourism essentially is what that falls under. So working with the government agencies, all stakeholders throughout the tourism community there, and our partners at Seagoing Green and Green Case Travel to really, and many local partners besides, but to create a recommendation for a sustainable tourism program that the entire country of the Bahamas can take on. And the Bahamas has many different islands. So this needs to take a slightly different approach than what we can in Barbados, because it has to be regionalized within each space as well. And to take into account that some islands are much more remote than others, but still creating this cohesive plan that the government and then the community can take on. And that will focus a lot on climate change and education as well as waste management, fishing, and these other aspects. And so that is a great example for how, if this is going hand in hand with legislation, with policy, and these voluntary certification schemes that travelers are looking for, then that can really shift the way that an entire country is responding to climate change and to environmental issues as well, especially in areas that are largely touristic again. So I think, so yeah, that's another example. And then the last example I'll share is we're doing some work now in Italy, in the Aeolian Islands, where there were localized bans on plastic, and similarly working with a local community fund there, the Aeolian Islands Preservation Fund, to hire local consultants to go door to door essentially and do these assessments, make sure everyone knows about the ban, help them find those options. And so it's been really, really rewarding and exciting. And I think coastal communities and islands in particular, an island is a really great closed system. So it's a great case study because we can see, okay, if you want to get trash off the island, that's expensive to pay for and to manage and deal with. And this is very true in examples we've seen in the Maldives as well, where they've been forced to innovate to avoid those unnecessary or challenging costs associated with creating waste. The concept of waste requires us to reconcile when we're thinking about an island and thinking about how to be self-sufficient there as well. So it's been interesting to focus on islands. And the last thing I'll mention there is that recently we've joined a coalition called the Plastic Free Islands Network, and very excited about how that is growing and how essentially we're connecting practitioners around the world to share how they're addressing similar challenges, but in slightly different contexts.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question because this is to do with a healthy and resilient ocean, and it's to do with pollution mapping. And it's kind of really interesting to see what ecotourism is doing, especially with like coastal communities and tracking of plastic pollution and things like that. But according to you, what do you think, which areas do you think is the largest pollution sector? Is it plastics? Is it consumer behavior? What is it that you could probably pinpoint and work towards?
Yeah, big question. I think, and certainly as we're thinking about pollution with regards to a healthy and resilient ocean, plastic pollution is just one piece of that. There's also fertilizer runoff, which doesn't seem like it would be pollution, but that influx of nutrients can create what we call dead zones when algae grow and suck the oxygen out of the water, block the sunlight, kill fish and other plants. So that's a major form of pollution. Also sewage runoff, which is really common around the world, where there just isn't enough infrastructure to properly handle and manage sewage. Sewage is going straight into the ocean too, causes similar challenges. And then all forms of industrial chemical pollution, oil spills. I mean, those are the things we see on the news there too. But this is happening in a very decentralized way. So with all of that flowing into our oceans, that liquid, that physical solid waste as well, our oceans are pretty tapped out. I know plastic pollution is something that gets a lot of focus because it's so visible. So some of those chemical pollutants and fertilizers, etc. It's not always as visible, but we can see plastic. We see plastic on the beach. There's this emotional response where it really does bother us. It doesn't. I think most people can agree, and that's what's been wonderful is it's quite a neutral politically issue because we can all agree we don't like plastic and would rather get rid of that. And now that we know so much more about how plastic is actually impacting our health, that we're drinking and eating and breathing this, there are so many reasons to be tackling plastics. And so within plastic, just to focus on that and where it's coming from, but also these other aspects that I mentioned, a lot of the responsibility and accountability actually falls on the private sector. This falls on businesses and on companies rather than individuals. And I think that shift between placing the blame on consumers for buying something versus on a company for making something is really significant. And yes, there is so much that we can do as one person with our community. There is so much that we can do. But I think that's why we focused a lot on industry action through the Blue Standard and empowering businesses to pioneer and lead this shift. Policy can certainly support that and complements that, and the two go hand in hand. It's actually interesting. I know we're recording this now to be played at a later time, but as we're speaking today, we're in the middle of UNEA 5.2, the UN Environmental Assembly gathering in Nairobi in Kenya. And one of the main topics of discussion there is a global plastics treaty. So negotiating a global plastics treaty, which at this point, most of the negotiations have already been done. And they've pretty much, the delegates from these different countries have pretty much aligned on a resolution. Fingers crossed, all goes well. By the time people listen to this, they'll know. But that's looking really good to actually create essentially a Paris Agreement for plastics globally, and
Excellent.
then every country will be hashing out the details for how their country will align to that. But what's currently in this resolution is a focus on upstream plastics as well. So not just cleanup, as you mentioned, monitoring and cleaning up plastic once it's already in the ocean, but how do we actually prevent that from being created in the first place? And how do we manage that responsibly upstream where we can as well? So focusing on that, focusing on communities and health and frontline communities who have been on the front lines of both the petrochemical facilities as well as the waste disposal sites and suffering from the polluted air and water and other land use impacts there too. So all of that is in this resolution, and it's legally binding. So right now it's looking really good for that. So I will just say, yes, companies can take action, and policies like this will really encourage the entire market to shift as well. So it's kind of at all levels.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then we have people like you and Oceanic Global who are making these efforts to educate the public and at the same time take care of our marine environment. Thank you so much, Cassia, for joining us. And for those listening, how can they follow you on your journey?
Yeah, thank you so much, Runa. So in terms of our website, I know I've spoken a lot about the Blue Standard. We actually have our own website for that at bluestandard.com. Our website for Oceanic Global is just oceanic.global. And that's also our social handle for Instagram, Facebook, oceanic.global. Twitter is just Oceanic Global. But you'll find us, reach out. Our contact info is on there if you'd like to get involved in any way. We'd love to work with you. It's a very open, inclusive movement, and we really do need everyone. So thank you again, Runa, for having us here and hosting this discussion.
Of course, I'm a big fan of your Instagram page. I think it's absolutely interactive and so educative. Thank you, Cassia.
Great. Thank you.